As the king said to Alice when she arrived in Wonderland, we must begin at the beginning, and that, obviously, is what an introduction does. The introduction to a piece of writing is obviously very important. It is the first impression that a reader will get of you and your essay. A good introduction will also perform several specific functions, which gives the reader necessary and useful information for the rest of the essay. The exact contents of an introduction will be affected by factors such as the discipline in which you are writing, the specific type of task you're doing, and the length of the writing task. However, there are three key aspects of an introduction which are universal to any piece of writing, namely, an interesting opening sentence, a thesis statement, and an outline of key sections. To consider these more effectively, we'll imagine that we're writing an essay with the following title: What should the United Nations do about climate change? Don't worry if the topic is not familiar to you. We'll keep the subject material as simple and as general as possible. So, firstly, an interesting opening sentence. If the first sentence of your essay is dull, you risk setting a negative tone for the rest of the essay. Conversely, an interesting opening sentence which hooks the reader's attention can make the reader much more interested in what you have to say. This is particularly important if the person marking your essay has another 20 or so to mark about the same subject. You want yours to stand out. For the purposes of our model essay, something like this should be suitable. The issue of climate change is one that has already and will continue to affect all humans, whether they live on the equator or at the poles. Of course, there are many other variants which could do an equally effective job, but this sentence shows the importance of the subject, demonstrates the impact the issue has had in recent times, and argues that unless something is done, the problem will escalate. We'll now turn to the subject of the thesis statement. We won't go into too much detail here about thesis statements, since that can be found in a separate lesson. But in brief, a thesis statement is the sentence which shows your position, i.e., your response to the essay question. This is particularly important since in the majority of essays you'll need to write, you'll need to be argumentative in one way or another. Your position should be clear from the beginning. Thus, in this essay we might say, the continued failure of national governments to reach consensus indicates that only the United Nations, the world's foremost intergovernmental organisation, can take the radical action which is urgently needed. The third thing which all introductions should do is present a clear outline to the reader. The end of the introduction should contain a map for the rest of the essay. If your reader has a sense of where the essay is going, they are far more likely to be interested in and focused on the essay contents. The outline should follow on naturally from your thesis statement. Thus, we could write, as such, this essay looks at three critical areas where only the UN can provide leadership. Firstly, it will examine limiting carbon emissions. Secondly, the issue of environmental taxes will be discussed. Finally, the necessity for investment in alternative energy sources will be presented. You will note that in terms of the tense you should use, either the present simple or future simple are acceptable. Using enumerators such as firstly, secondly, finally can also provide a useful structure. Take a moment now to read through the whole of the sample introduction. When you have done this, continue with the lesson, where we will look at other kinds of information which you may also find in an introduction and a list of common problems encountered. As noted at the beginning of this lesson, depending on the specific discipline or type of writing task you have to do, there is other information which you might also include in an introduction. We'll now take a look at some of this information. Firstly, an interesting quotation, data, or statistics. Such information can be used to clearly show or emphasize a particular point. It is also a way of grabbing the reader's attention early on and getting them interested in the topic. In the context of our essay, you might present evidence which shows the impact of climate change. For example, according to Hansen 2006, global temperature has increased by 0.6 centigrade over the past 30 years. Secondly, definition. In certain essays, it is necessary to provide your definition of a key term at an early stage. If the definition is relatively short, 1 or 2 sentences, the introduction is the logical place to do this. If the term is particularly controversial or ambiguous and needs more analysis, it may make sense to devote the whole of the second paragraph to it. Thirdly, background information. Similarly, depending on the type of essay, you might devote the whole of the second paragraph to background information. Remember that the kind of information you include should be relevant and you should not go into too much detail. And finally, the rationale or niche, meaning a brief explanation as to why you have chosen this topic and what academic gap you are filling. Again, see the separate lesson on this topic. Now, as we discussed before, introductions are not easy things to write, and we'll take a look at 3 of the most commonly made mistakes which you should try and avoid. Firstly, don't just repeat the title or question. There is absolutely no purpose in doing this. You should certainly refer to or comment on the question, but there is no value in just saying again what is already there. Secondly, don't go into too much detail and write too much. This is often a temptation, but you should resist it. The introduction should just introduce. Leave the specific details for the rest of the essay. An introduction should be roughly 10% of the essay length. Thirdly, don't write exactly the same information in your introduction as in your conclusion. Although they are related and may cover similar material, they have different purposes. Again, see the separate lesson on conclusions to see the specific differences. Finally, it may help to think of an introduction like an advert or trailer for a film. The trailer tries to capture the spirit of the whole film, and in doing so reveals some of the most interesting bits of information. An introduction should, as far as possible, try to do the same.